On the morning of September 15, 1950, the calm, gray dawn was violently torn apart by the combined fury of the United Nations fleet. For hours, the sky had been a canvas of smoke and fire, first from the precision strikes of Marine F-4U-4B Corsairs, then the relentless naval bombardment from destroyers and cruisers. The sustained shelling was designed not only to destroy defenses but to terrify the defenders, a psychological softening that was critical to the day's success. But as the clock edged past 6:30 a.m., a moment of eerie, absolute silence descended. A silence broken only by the heavy, anxious churn of engines. This was the sound of the assault waves, the landing craft, utility, LCUs, and landing ship, tanks, LSTs, carrying the first wave of U.S. Marines. They were heading straight for Wulmidu Island, the fortified fortress guarding the very entrance to the port of Inchon. This was the opening salvo of Operation Chromite, a military gamble so audacious, so utterly impossible, that nearly every senior officer had fought General Douglas MacArthur to stop it. They believed they were sailing into a massacre. To understand the sheer audacity of Chromite, you have to rewind just 3 months. In June 1950, the world watched in horror as the North Korean People's Army, armed and trained by the Soviet Union, poured across the 38th parallel. This wasn't a slow invasion. It was a devastating military flood. The invasion was so rapid, so well executed, that the South Korean and meager initial American forces were completely overwhelmed. Within weeks, the map of Korea had shrunk to a small, desperately defended pocket in the southeast corner, the Pusan Perimeter. The United Nations forces, including the beleaguered U.S. 24th Infantry Division and the quickly reinforced U.S. 8th Army, were pinned against the coastline, fighting for survival in a brutal defensive line stretching 140 miles. The fighting was savage, often hand-to-hand, particularly in critical sectors like the bowling alley and the battles around Taegu, where American and ROK units fought with their last reserves. The troops inside the perimeter were exhausted, constantly on the brink of being overrun, and their morale was fading under the constant NKPA pressure. They were simply running out of men, ammunition, and room to maneuver. Political and military pressure on General MacArthur, the commander-in-chief of the Far East Command, was immense. The entire Cold War balance seemed to hang on whether this tiny perimeter could hold against the continuous NKPA offensives. MacArthur, however, saw not defensive desperation, but strategic opportunity. While everyone else focused on the shrinking perimeter, the general stared at the map, searching for the one knockout blow that could reverse the war instantly. He believed that attacking the enemy's front at Pusan was a costly, drawn-out battle, a bloody slog that would cost tens of thousands of lives. The solution, in his mind, was a massive, paralyzing strike deep into the enemy's rear, cutting off their supply lines and forcing the NKPA to collapse in disarray. The target he chose was Inchon, the port city nearest the South Korean capital of Seoul. The moment MacArthur uttered the word Inchon, the military planning world erupted in protest, bordering on rebellion. Naval and Marine planners, the very experts who had perfected the art of the amphibious landing across the brutal Pacific campaigns of World War II, were united in their dissent. They laid out a list of deadly, almost insurmountable obstacles, conditions that violated every single doctrine of successful amphibious warfare. First and foremost were the tides of doom. The tidal range in Inchon Harbor is one of the most volatile and extreme in the entire world, surging over 30 feet, nearly 10 meters, between high and low tide. This fact alone meant that a landing could only be conducted during two specific, brief high-water windows on the chosen date, September 15th. Miss those windows and the entire invasion force, including the invaluable landing ship, tanks, LSTs, needed to offload heavy equipment, would be stranded, lying exposed for hours on vast, thick mudflats, targets for every NKPA gun. Navy analysts confirmed that the critical clearance for LSTs only existed for a handful of hours, making the timing non-negotiable and utterly unforgiving. Secondly, the harbor approach was a deadly choke point, known as the Flying Fish Channel. It was constrained by two peninsulas and dotted with small islands like Woolmedu, creating a narrow, winding channel perfect for a defender to lay extensive minefields and zero inshore batteries. Any ship navigating this channel was a sitting duck, vulnerable to flanking fire from multiple fortified positions. And finally, there were simply no suitable beaches. Inchon's coastline consisted not of sandy shores, but of deep, tidal mud and, more ominously, high concrete seawalls and retaining structures, in some places towering 4 feet above the ramps of the landing craft. There was no gentle slope for a mass landing. It was a fortified, vertical barrier designed to be held. The legendary debate in Tokyo saw MacArthur's staff, and especially the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington, trying desperately to dissuade him. General Oliver P. Smith, commander of the 1st Marine Division, voiced deep skepticism. Admiral James Doyle, who was present, later quoted one of the senior planners as saying, "The tides are not right. The mud is too deep. The defenses are too strong. This operation is impossible." They presented multiple, more tactically sound alternatives on the East Coast, notably a landing at Cunson. But MacArthur was fixed on the strategic prize, the immediate psychological and logistical impact of seizing Seoul. He famously countered his critics with an argument of surprise, stating, "I can almost hear the North Koreans laughing at the idea of a landing at Inchon. The very fact that it is a bad place to land is precisely why the enemy will not expect us." The moment of decision. The final approval hinged on a highly dramatic meeting aboard the flagship Mount McKinley in August. MacArthur, pacing the room, delivered an impassioned, almost evangelical defense of his plan. He concluded by telling the skeptical chiefs that he would personally lead the landing if necessary, effectively staking his entire career and legacy on the outcome. This force of will, backed by his immense personal reputation, broke the unified front of dissent. The Joint Chiefs, begrudgingly and under immense political pressure, gave their approval. Operation Chromite was scheduled. MacArthur was well aware that his bold plan required maximum strategic surprise. To achieve this, the UN forces executed complex deception operations. Codenamed Operation Blue Hearts, the 7th Infantry Division conducted a massive, conspicuous feint toward Cunson, the very alternative landing site favored by the planners. Reconnaissance planes and ships repeatedly probed the Cunson area, broadcasting false chatter and conducting aggressive maneuvers, effectively convincing NKPA High Command that the attack would come there. This successful deception played a critical role in leaving Inchon significantly underdefended. With the invasion greenlit, the Marine Corps faced the second Herculean task, assembling the force in impossible time. Due to the massive post-World War II drawdowns, the Corps was a fraction of its wartime strength. The 1st Marine Division, slated to spearhead the operation, was woefully short of manpower, equipment, and training. The call went out for the reserve force, a move that would become central to the operation's lore and an intense emotional point for the Corps. This was not a slow, organized mobilization. It was a frantic, terrifying scramble. Veterans of Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Okinawa, men who had returned to civilian life as students, salesmen, and plumbers, were wrenched from their lives and civilian careers, yanked back into uniform with mere weeks to prepare. They left jobs, wives, and children, often with no clear idea of where they were going or what they were fighting. Many of the arriving reservists had never seen active duty, let alone intense combat training. This division was being built on the fly, a dangerous patchwork force of hardened veterans and raw recruits thrown together by necessity. Colonel Lewis B. Chesty Puller, the legendary five-time Navy Cross recipient and commander of the 7th Marines, oversaw the logistical nightmare at Camp Pendleton. The scene was pure chaos. Newly reactivated troops, many overweight and out of shape, mixing with young, untested recruits. Puller had to rely on his decades of experience and sheer personal authority to impose order. He recounted ordering company commanders to literally pull mothballed gear and cosmoline-caked weapons from World War II storage to issue to the arriving Marines. Rifles, dusty from years in storage, were hastily cleaned. There was no time for unit cohesion. There was no time for full-scale tactical exercises or practice assaults. As Colonel Puller stated, they were giving the men rudimentary instruction on weapons, while they were already sailing across the globe to Korea. The 1st, 5th, and 7th Marine regiments were shipped out at different times, often with different parts of the division already at sea. Yet, incredibly, by the end of August 1950, 1 STMAR DIV was en route or already in Korea, following MacArthur's aggressive timeline to conduct the landing in September. The sheer logistical feat of equipping and deploying an entire division of this size and complexity in less than 3 months remains a testament to the Corps' foundational flexibility and the tenacity of its leadership. The final countdown and the Navy's risk began on September 10th, as Joint Task Force 7, comprised of 1 STMAR DIV under Major General O. P. Smith, multinational naval vessels, and the 1st Marine Air Wing, approached the deadly coastline. The naval component, a multinational armada including ships from Britain, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, took the initial, terrifying risk. Before the landing craft could even approach, the narrow channel had to be cleared. The U.S. Navy destroyers, including the Mansfield and De Haven, were sent on dangerous fire missions deep into the Flying Fish Channel, a mission naval officers wryly called the Tally-Ho, to bait the North Korean shore batteries into revealing their positions. They were successful, drawing heavy counter-battery fire, but the NKPA defenses were swiftly and violently suppressed by the covering destroyers. Then came the terrifying, slow work of the minesweepers, working under continuous, harassing fire. The ships had literally paved the way to the beaches through fire and steel, but the danger was ever present. The NKPA had the port defended by the 226th Independent Marine Regiment, supported by the 918th Artillery Regiment. Crucially, nearby in Seoul, they had the 18th Infantry Division and the 42nd Mechanized Regiment, equipped with the formidable T-34 tanks. September 15, 1950, the day to pull off the impossible. The assault was divided into 3 distinct phases: green, red, and blue. Green Beach, the storming of Woolmedo. The first objective was the fortified offshore island of Woolmedo, a rocky sentinel commanding the approaches to the main harbor. The assault was timed precisely for the morning high tide. At 6:30 a.m., the bombardment ceased, replaced by the humming of the landing craft carrying the Marines of 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. The assault on Woolmedo, however, did not descend into the anticipated bloodbath. The intense naval and air bombardment of the previous days had been devastatingly effective, turning the island's surface into rubble and confusing the chain of command. Resistance was light. Scattered pockets of NKPA troops holed up in concrete bunkers and caves. When initial hand grenades proved ineffective against the reinforced positions, the ingenuity of the American fighting man took over. Marines flagged down an M26 Pershing tank, a crucial piece of heavy armor in a war dominated by the T-34. This Pershing was specially equipped with a bulldozer blade. Ignoring a final flurry of resistance, the tank lowered its blade and shoved a massive wall of debris and rock into the cave mouth, permanently sealing the defender's fate. By 8 a.m., Colonel Robert Taplett, commander of 3/5, radioed the astonishing message, "Woolmedo secure. The cost? a mere 17 casualties. The first and arguably the most strategically dangerous objective was taken. But the fight was only beginning. The tide immediately began to recede, exposing the vast, sticky mudflats, leaving 3/5 isolated on the island. They were forced to wait out the next 7 hours until the rest of the division arrived on the evening high tide, fully aware that a counterattack could come at any moment. Red Beach, the vertical wall assault. The main event was scheduled for the late afternoon high tide. At 5:30 p.m., under a renewed, absolutely furious naval bombardment, the Marines headed for shore. The landing was split between two sections of the inner harbor. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Murray's 5th Marines headed toward Red Beach. This sector was the most terrifying of all. It had no beach, only the looming, sheer concrete seawall. The water lapped directly against the wall, which in some places stood 4 feet above the ramps of the landing craft. The coxswains of the landing craft had to show incredible nerve and skill, slamming the boats violently against the concrete and gunning their engines to hold the ramps flush against the wall. Marines had mere seconds to scramble. Under blistering fire from enemy positions on the rooftops and bunkers above them, they first hurled smoke and fragmentation grenades over the top of the wall to suppress the defenders. Then they executed the impossible. They braced wooden scaling ladders, hastily procured and deemed suicidal by the planners. Up the ramp and against the wall, clambering up one by one, exposed targets silhouetted against the darkening sky as enemy bullets snapped overhead. Critically, the landing depended heavily on the LVT-3 and LVT-4 Amtraks, amphibious tractors designed to traverse the kind of mud that would stop a conventional vehicle. These tracked beasts were vital for carrying troops over the worst of the silt and delivering them to the seawall base. Once over the wall, the Marines faced the fiercest resistance of the day. The terrain behind Red Beach was riddled with bunkers and fighting positions, extending into the buildings and warehouses right at the water's edge. This was immediate, brutal close-quarters urban combat. Squads fought house to house, clearing snipers and machine gun nests embedded in the concrete. The fighting resembled the relentless, deadly island-hopping campaigns of the Central Pacific, now a decade old. The 5th Marines systematically neutralized NKPA positions one by one, relying heavily on grenades, flamethrowers, and the raw, relentless tenacity that defined the Corps. Close air support, honed to a razor's edge by the Navy and Marine Corps, roared in low, delivering precise strikes on targets designated by forward air controllers, often just yards from the Marine positions, a true test of faith in their air support. Blue Beach, the mud and the mayhem. Simultaneously, Colonel Chesty Puller's own 1st Marines were hitting Blue Beach further south. While Red Beach was a terrifying concrete barrier, Blue Beach was a slow, debilitating hell of mud and confusion. Landing craft piled out of the heavy smoke and fog, only to get thoroughly stuck in the deep, debilitating quagmire that made up most of the coastline. The landing immediately descended into organized chaos. Heavy equipment, including jeeps and artillery pieces, became mired in the deep, sticky silt. Marines were forced to abandon their vehicles and equipment and trudge ashore through the hip-deep mud, compounding the problems of confusion. Again, the Amtraks proved their worth, ferrying troops from the stranded LSTs to the shore where conventional boats would have bogged down. Some follow-on troops landed in the wrong locations altogether and had to execute long, desperate marches across the peninsula to rejoin their units. Chesty Puller himself, overseeing the landing, was everywhere, focusing fiercely on restoring order and pushing the troops inland as quickly as possible. His constant presence and sheer will galvanized the Marines, demonstrating the kind of veteran leadership the hastily assembled division desperately needed. He famously told his men, "We've been looking for the enemy for several days now. We've finally found them. We're going to attack and attack and attack until we can't be attacked anymore. Despite the logistical setbacks, the Marines' fighting spirit was unbroken. They swiftly overwhelmed the scattered NKPA resistance they encountered, mostly isolated bunkers, reducing them with tanks, flamethrowers, and sheer firepower. As night fell, the 1st Marines paused their advance on the hills overlooking the beach. The landings may have been confused and messy, but the regiment was ashore, consolidated, and ready to push into Inchon proper the following day. As the fighting subsided and the sounds of battle faded into the pre-dawn quiet, Operation Chromite had succeeded. But the fight was far from over. The 1st and 5th Marines quickly consolidated their positions, and the Marines from Woolmedu crossed the newly captured causeway to join the main force. The push for Seoul, MacArthur's ultimate objective, began immediately. The NKPA desperately attempted to hold the lines along the Han River, pouring in troops from the 18th Division and other reserves, but the element of surprise was complete. The Marines faced heavy resistance during the river crossing. Once again, the Amtraks and newly arrived engineer bridging units were essential for the initial crossing of the wide, fast-flowing river, ferrying troops and supplies. The most brutal fighting began when the Marines entered Seoul itself. This was not a quick surrender. The battle for the capital became a savage, house-to-house, block-by-block engagement lasting for over a week, starting on September 21st. The Marines, supported by M26 Pershing tanks, had to systematically clear fortified barricades and entrenched positions. The fighting was particularly intense around the government house and the main Capitol building. Every alleyway was a choke point, and every building was a potential bunker. Casualty rates soared during this brutal urban grind. The city was finally recaptured on September 25th, a major symbolic and strategic victory, although MacArthur had missed his arbitrary deadline. The strategic tsunami and the final reflection. The sailors and Marines at Inchon had achieved what was widely considered militarily impossible. They had successfully executed an amphibious assault on one of the most inhospitable landing sites imaginable, and they had done so after assembling the entire force, half-trained and half-equipped, in less than 3 months. The strategic impact was immediate and staggering. The hammer had fallen where the enemy least expected it. The landing force, now consolidated in Inchon and pushing toward Seoul, had completely cut the main NKPA supply lines to the Pusan Perimeter, paralyzing the North Korean war effort. The NKPA, suddenly facing a massive threat in their rear, was forced to abandon their offensive at Pusan and begin a desperate, chaotic retreat, saving the entire southern front. The contrast was stark. In early September, UN forces were fighting for survival. By the end of the month, they were conducting a massive offensive pursuit. Within days, the momentum of the war had shifted completely. The U.S. 8th Army forces, previously trapped in Pusan, broke out and began pursuing the fleeing NKPA units. Abandoned equipment, including countless T-34s and artillery pieces, littered the roads, proof of the speed and panic of the North Korean collapse. Operation Chromite didn't just win a battle. It broke the North Korean army's back and reversed the course of the Korean War in a single, audacious stroke, solidifying MacArthur's reputation as a military genius who was unafraid to defy conventional wisdom. As the sun rose above Observation Hill on September 16th, the Marines surveyed the smoking, newly captured city. They didn't know then that this moment of triumph, the audacious victory at Inchon and the liberation of Seoul, was the prelude to an even greater trial. Having defied the odds at Inchon, these Marines were bound for the frozen peaks and unforgiving brutality of the Chosin Reservoir just 2 months later. But for now, their focus was on the immediate task. Inchon was theirs. They had made the impossible look easy.